it does seem like there is kind of like an integral pattern flowing through all things, which, you can call that whatever you want. You can call that energy, you can call it, divinity. Some people call it whatever, other more like religious based things. But I think it's about recognizing that and recognizing that we have the power to sort of use that for betterment, for the betterment of our own lives. We have the power to use that for good.
I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Same Work Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Do you believe in omens? Like these little moments in your life that point you to your future? Maybe your life has given you some kind of sign or signal at some point, guiding you to make certain decisions or take a few risks. Or maybe you felt yourself drawn towards materials or objects by some kind of powerful energy that you can't really explain. In this story, we're going to meet Christi Johnson, a designer who creates incredible textiles and embroideries. She's an artist who's deeply connected to her craft. And in this story, we're going to explore 4 omens that guided Christi away from a decade-long career in the fashion scenes of Los Angeles and New York City to a textile studio in the Catskills, where she rebuilds textiles, dyes them with plants that she grows in her own garden, and infuses her collections with ritual and magic. Meg Stively chats with Christi Johnson for this story.
Christi Johnson is deeply connected to her craft. Before you listen to Christi's story, you might want to go look at some of her work, either her garments made by rebuilding and dyeing fabric scraps for her brand Mixed Color, or her colorful embroidered talismans called Stitch Wishes. But if you're totally brand new to her work, you might want to keep it a surprise until after hearing her story. While I was talking to Christi, I was lucky enough to see her face-to-face over a video chat. She called from her studio in the Catskills in New York. She was all smiles, talking excitedly with her hands, wearing a well-loved t-shirt that looked like it might be vintage, and she had just emerged from a long hike in the forest. In her studio behind her were these wooden shelves that were stacked with books and all these jars of dried plants. She's incredibly laid back, but you can tell that Christi is deeply in touch with her creativity. That might be because she grew up nurtured by creativity, watching her mom, sister, and grandma sew.
I guess I've always kind of had a love for clothes and, I was like, had dolls as a kid. And I didn't really care about like the dolls and their story. It was more like, what can she wear? And like, how can I decorate her in different ways? And like hot gluing my mom's fabric scraps to my Barbies or whatever. And then a big part of my influence, I think, is my sister studied fashion design. And she's 12 years older than me. So it's kind of a big age difference. So by the time I'm 6, she's going to college for fashion design. So that was a huge influence. And I was always like looking through her pattern making books and trying to figure out how I can make my own clothes and giving it a shot. And again, like my mom was a total, like she's a big crafter, a textile artist, like loves making things. And so I had access to all sorts of scrap materials and the sewing machine. And, like she was like, yeah, oh, great. Like my kid's just going to sit here and play with stuff while I make stuff, while I have my own craft time. That's going to be great. So it was definitely nurtured in the family as far as just being surrounded by it at all times.
As a kid, Christi was already picking up the tools and creative mindset that would shape how she created clothing in the future. She saw how her grandmother treated fabric, thread, and notably her fabric scraps. In Christi's story, playing with fabric scraps is one of the first and most powerful omens that would point her to her future career.
My grandmother on my mom's side also did a lot of sewing, and I loved playing around in her sewing studio. And she has very much kind of like had very much of the Depression era mindset of like, you save every little piece of thread, so there was a lot of fun stuff to play with in her studio.
With her grandmother's fabric scraps in mind, and inspired by her sister's experience in fashion design school, Christi arrived in Los Angeles to study at Otis College of Art and Design, where she was quickly absorbed into the business of the fashion industry.
So I went to LA and studied there, and it was very much like geared towards getting you set up for a career in the fashion industry. So it wasn't really like, you're not like making a collection and, getting really conceptual. It was very, very organized around career, which is great because it's like building you up for getting a job. So I did that. And I worked in the fashion industry for probably 10 years in LA, and worked at various places, maybe a little less, maybe 8 years. And I worked for a few different companies, from like cashmere sweater companies to a woman that had all of her clothing, Rose Nichols. She had everything produced in-house in Los Angeles, or like offsite, but it was all done in Los Angeles, and it was all beautiful silks and everything, to working for Quicksilver, where everything's manufactured in China. And, it's like I kind of worked at every different scale of the fashion industry. And at no point did it ever feel like it made any sense to me.
Christi draws a distinction between fashion and clothing, a divide that would only grow stronger as she pursued her fashion career in Los Angeles. For a fashion designer, working in LA would be a dream. But for a designer who cares much more about the process and the impact of making clothing, rather than selling the next hit fashion line, this divide between fashion and clothing can quickly become a trap.
Fashion is telling you what's trending, what's now, what's old, and clothing is just forever, especially good clothing. It stands the test of time. So that I find way more important.
Despite struggling to find a connection to the fashion industry in Los Angeles, Christi did make a very important discovery, inspired by a childhood love of tie-dye.
Okay, so I've always loved working with dyes. I feel like I should start that off with saying that, like, growing up, like, my mom was really into tie-dye. So it was like all of us had like tie-dye t-shirts constantly. Like I had my 5th birthday was like a tie-dye party where my friends came over and we all tie-dyed our own t-shirts. And so it was like kind of a weird family tradition. It was like, yeah, tie-dye. It's like so much fun. And so I love the process of dyeing, just because the way that the water kind of flows in with the dyes in different areas. And no matter how many times you like do the same tie-dye, it's going to turn out different every time. So I've always loved dyeing things. When I was working in the fashion industry, I was working for Rose Nichols, and I was kind of like the house dyer. And so, I was constantly like at the slop sink, like trying to match colors. I love colors. I love mixing colors. I love, just discovering sort of new, beautiful combinations of colors next to each other.
Christi's lifelong love of tie-dye pivoted to natural dyeing. I asked Christi to describe her first natural dyeing experience, since natural dye is at the foundation of her creative practice. She told me that she found some dyes at Dharma Trading Company and was super excited to give them a try. And, well, the resulting color wasn't ideal.
I was ordering synthetic dyes from them, and so I was like, oh, they have natural dyes too, let me try this. And so I ordered the madder root from them, and I got it, and it's just these giant wood chunks, like root pieces like the size of my pinky. And I was like, I don't even know what to do with this. I have no idea. And I just remember, looking for stuff on the internet. And this was probably, oh my God, this is almost 10 years ago at this point, probably 8 years ago. And the internet was not as full of information as it is now, which, not to say that there's not a bunch of crap on the internet right now. There's a lot of like false dye tutorials where I'm like, no, beets are not going to work, my dear. Like beets do not work as dye. Let me just tell you that. I have tried. I've seen friends try it. It doesn't work no matter what the website tells you. Yeah, but so I tried to look up information on the internet, and the only thing that I could find, and I think maybe I had like 1 or 2 natural dye books, and everything said like, you have to chop up these wood pieces to be able to dye with it. So you have to, the best thing to do would be put them in a wood chipper. And I was like, who has a wood chipper? Like, now like I live in the country and like have chickens and like, wheelbarrows, and like still, I'm like, I still don't know anybody with a wood chipper. So that was sort of like, okay, well, that's not going to work. So I think I just soaked it. I just soaked them in water for, weeks. And I kept trying to cut them with the kitchen knife. I was like, maybe I can soak them enough so that I could chop them up with a kitchen knife. And I was never able to do it. And then I tried dyeing with it, and it just turned out kind of like a pale, like Band-Aid-y color. Just like, kind of a pale pinky beige. It was really uninteresting. And then, come to find out, to work with madder root, you need to have a mordant. And I didn't know how to get a mordant. I didn't know what a mordant was. So that was my first natural dye experiment. I was like, I could have done this with like spilled hibiscus juice on my t-shirt and it would have had the same color.
In case you are wondering, mordant is a chemical that helps natural dye adhere to fabric, so you actually get some color when you use it. Since information about natural dyeing wasn't available back then, Christi just didn't have access to it. Despite this, and despite the beige results from her first attempt at natural dye, she didn't give up. That's an important thing to know about Christi for later. She didn't toss the failed project in the garbage. She approaches mistakes or failures in a really powerful way, by transforming her mistakes into something else. Christi continued to work in Los Angeles and grow her knowledge of dyeing. She also came to a staggering realization that would shift how she approached her craft moving forward. The production of her designs, the waste of fabric, the pollution from the dyes, all of this had profoundly harmful effects on the planet.
When I was working in the fashion industry, I was working for Rosé Nichols, and I was kind of like the house dyer. And so, I was constantly like at the slop sink, like trying to match colors. I love colors. I love mixing colors. I love, just discovering sort of new, beautiful combinations of colors next to each other. So yeah, the reason I wanted to switch to natural dyes is because while I was working for Rosé, I had been working with all these other dyes. And one day I came home from work and I blew my nose, and there's like blue on the napkin. I was like, oh my God, all of these powdered dyes that I'm working with are going into my bloodstream. Like if they're going into my lungs, they're coursing through my bloodstream, and that totally freaked me out.
The blue color staining Christi's nose after working with dyed textiles, that stubborn piece of madder root that left a pale beige Band-Aid color, these mishaps with dye are the second omen in Christi's story. We'll hear more about madder root later, but for now, Christi still hadn't found her place in the Los Angeles fashion industry. She had a bird's eye view of the possibilities that the fashion scene in LA had to offer. From small labels to larger fashion companies, she was able to identify what worked for her and what didn't. At one point, she advised how to program machines to mimic hand embroidery, a craft that is now at the center of her work. A craft that she most definitely always does by hand, not by machine.
We have a machine that can embroider, yet somehow it will never be able to imitate the hand stitch. And I worked with machine embroidery experts at trying to figure out how to make it look more as much like a hand stitch as humanly possible. And that was one of my jobs that I was working. It was like, okay, how can we make these look like hand stitches? How do we program them to be uneven? We program them to be too thick and awkward. And it just we were never quite able to capture it. And there's truly something about having the thread that goes under and then back up and then under and then back up and continues to go above and below the fabric that really something about humans, we just enjoy that so much. And I think there's like some real sort of archaic connection to that, and what that used to mean, and the value that used to give our fibers. We still have a connection to that. And I love being able to see people kind of not understand why they're attracted to it. Not understand why they enjoy doing it so much. Because it takes so long, but it just doesn't matter.
Luckily, Christi has good memories from Coastwise, which was the last company she worked for before she left Los Angeles. She designed embroideries for their clothing and practiced the colorful, vibrant techniques that would ultimately become one of the most recognizable aspects of her work.
The last job I had in the fashion industry in LA was I was designing embroideries for the back of chambray shirts, or the back, the front, whatever. So they were these kind of, my boss is super supportive, still like totally. I have a really good experience with him, loved working for him, but it was like, I have free range here. He's allowing me to do the artwork that I want to do on the shirts. We're having them made in LA, which was really important for me. I'm going to these manufacturing places. I know the people who are sewing them. And it still was like, this isn't right. Luckily, he saw that and was like, you want to get out of here?
Leaving Los Angeles might have been a really difficult decision for some fashion designers, but not if you had an opportunity to participate in a residency through the Textile Art Center in New York City.
So then I was able to move to New York City and do a residency at Textile Art Center. And I really wanted to, it's funny that I was living in Los Angeles and I wanted to move to New York City so that I could learn more about natural dyes. So I go from having like a backyard and a garden in Los Angeles to being in an apartment in New York City. But there were a lot more people studying natural dyes at that time. That was probably maybe 6 or 7 years ago. At that point in time, it was really hard for me to find natural dye education in Los Angeles. I learned about indigo from Nikki Livingston in LA, and then I learned about iron painting and mud painting from Kenya Miles, who lives in Oakland. But then other than that, it seemed like most of the people who were teaching were in New York City. And there was also, through Textile Art Center, then there's a community of other people who are exploring natural dyes as well. And so we were able to kind of really cross-reference and like chat about like what was working, what wasn't working, what park you could find black walnuts in. And like, so having that sort of community was like completely unreal to me. I had never had like such a strong like textile arts community.
While in New York, Christi strengthened her connection to designing and selling clothing. She created her own collection, incorporating natural dyes and showcasing embroidery and patchwork. Christi adores the history of textiles, especially showing the possibilities that come from the techniques that we've used in clothing production for so long. But the reality of manufacturing, going to trade shows, and dealing with production errors quickly hit her.
One time I had like one person sewing for me that I hired, and she was super sweet, but she sewed like the front and the back of the shirt with different fabrics. It was just like it felt like this struggle that was like basically saying like, maybe this isn't for you, like this is just not your, sometimes when something is so hard, you have like, I kind of have to recognize like, maybe I'm forcing this.
Luckily, along with the logistical frustrations of design and operations, something else was revealed to Christi. This was a big omen. When Christi would drop off her collections at shops, they would ask her questions about naturally dyed garments. How do you take care of them? How did you get this color? They'd ask her. After answering the same questions over and over, Christi thought maybe instead of just selling her naturally dyed clothes, she could teach other people about natural dyeing.
But then I also, at the same time, a lot of people were reaching out to have me teach with natural dyeing and also with embroidery. And that was something, I love showing people how to do things. So that was something that came really naturally for me. But I didn't necessarily think of that as a career path necessarily. Like it wasn't like a cohesive, like, oh, and then I will be a teacher. It was just like, this person at this store is looking for somebody to teach natural dyes, and I have a good relationship with her, and she's seen the work that I do, and let's do it that way. And it was, I think it was one of those things where I really like showing people how to do things. And I found it really important to educate people on the process of natural dyeing, because as I was making the clothes and bringing them to stores, there was a lot of education that went with it. It's like, you can't just like wash them with vinegar, let's say, or, if you get lemon juice splashed on it, you kind of have to rinse it off pretty quick. Things are pH sensitive, want to leave them in sunlight. And so there felt like that was kind of a natural evolution from educating people on how to care for the clothes to educating them on like, also, you can save your avocado pits and then re-dye it yourself if you want.
With this newfound appreciation for teaching, Christi's vision for her approach to textiles was really starting to solidify. She knew what she wanted to make, and she knew who she wanted to make it for.
The cuts of my clothes were always very free-flowing. Like, I never wanted anything to feel restrictive, and just the way that I like to make things is that, like, if somebody is, changing shapes and sizes within their own body, that their clothes don't necessarily emphasize that for them. I find that to be really important in my own daily interactions. I don't want anything pinching. I don't want anything binding. I also hate sewing zippers. I hate sewing buttonholes. I hate sewing buttons. So it was like, real quick, I was like, there are no zippers. There are no buttons. There are no, maybe there's an elastic tunnel. Maybe, But the clothing that I was making were really for people who like to feel free in their clothes, who still like to look great, but know that they can like go run up a hill if they need to, and not be like bound and tucked in all sorts of different ways. And also generally people that appreciate plants and appreciate being in nature. And that's kind of like, it goes hand in hand with the natural dyes, because all of the dyes have their own story. I feel like a lot of herbs do, where we can connect to these different herbs by, understanding how they were used in the past and understanding how they grow. And I felt like there's a lot of that available with natural dyes too, where we can start to think about like, how are they growing? Some of the dye plants grow, really abundantly and really fast, and, and they make these like bright neon yellows. And for me, that kind of like, there's all these unions of conceptual ideas of plants, and also like specific literal uses of these plants.
If Christi were to look back at all of these lessons and hints and tricks and truths that she was picking up throughout her career in New York City and Los Angeles, It almost seems obvious how she ended up where she is now. But at this time in her story, there was one really big missing piece. She needed a place, a physical space, to allow her creative vision to come to life. And this space would be her third omen.
So I was just doing all these little side jobs, basically, and I was, on the train like 4 hours a day, going to and from these side jobs, and I would get home at the end of the day and I had no time for my own work. And it was just this realization of like, I'm working for everybody else to pay for the apartment that has enough room for a studio in it. My room, I just got a place with a bedroom that was big enough to be my bedroom and studio. And I didn't have any time to make anything in it. And so it was just this like, this is horrible. So I was basically realized pretty early on that I was like, the city is not for me, but I can't move back to LA. I knew that LA was also not for me. And I had started dating somebody who I now live with, on one of our first dates, after a few dates, he was like, hey, do you want to come up to the Catskills and go visit my friends doing this event and everything? And I was just like, yeah, sure. Why not? Sure. I would love to get out of the city. I think it had been like 6 months since I had left the city. And so I came up to the Catskills with him and was just like, why are we not living here? Sort of like, I was basically like, don't make me leave. Like, I just want to be here forever and ever and ever. Please don't make me leave.
Coming up, in nearly a complete reversal of her life in New York City, Christi now wakes up each morning in the Catskills with a natural dye garden in her backyard, an outdoor kitchen for boiling plants and herbs, and the ability to craft in nature along with the seasons.
We basically lived on our friend's farm in a trailer. Our friends, they have a pig and chicken farm, and it's all free-range chickens. And so each trailer has 50 chickens or whatever that live in there. And so they're constantly buying trailers so they can expand the farm. And so they bought this one trailer and they're like, chickens can't live in here. Like, the fridge still works, So they were like, come on, come and live in the trailer on our farm.
If you're enjoying this podcast so far, you might really like joining in at the Seamwork community. In addition to this podcast, every month we create new sewing patterns, a video class, and a monthly digital magazine. When you become a member, you get access to all of that each month, plus you can hang out and talk in our private community forum. We're all really welcoming, and it's a great place to ask questions, post projects, or share your thoughts. Right now, podcast listeners can get a special discount of 50% off the unlimited plan. That gets you access to our full catalog of over 150 patterns, and you can download as many as you want, whenever you want. It's only $90 for a whole year of patterns, plus classes, videos, magazine articles, and access to the private community. Check it out at seamwork.com/go/podcast50, or look for the link in the show notes.
To quickly recap, Christi's visit to the Catskills sparked a swift desire to leave New York City. She had a clear vision for the type of clothing that she wanted to design. She felt empowered by her own sustainable practices that eschewed mass clothing production. She'd immersed herself in a community of dyers and makers, and she realized that she loved to teach her craft to other people. It just turns out that Christi wasn't made for New York City. Or maybe New York City wasn't made for Christi.
The city just got worse and worse, basically. I mean, the city's fine. My experience in the city got worse and worse. Other people have great experiences in the city. I just feel like I got there at a time when, everything was really expensive. And everybody that I worked for lived on the outskirts of Brooklyn in different areas because that's all they could afford. And so we're all going from outskirts to outskirts. And it just became just a total hassle. You spend all day on the subway. And so a few months later, I was kind of totally fed up. I was like, I'm moving back to Florida. I don't know, I'll figure something out.
Christi didn't have to figure something out because an opportunity came to her instead. She and her boyfriend house sat for a few months on their friend's farm. If it gives you a sense of how overwhelmingly awesome this experience was for Christi, her friend's farm was actually called Majestic Farm.
He was like, hey, what if we had any opportunity to maybe house sit for a friend and his bunnies and alpaca and sheep and chicken? And I was like, yes, I would love to do that. So we did that. And that was kind of basically our test to see if we could live up here. Well, he kind of knew he could already live up here, but it was my test because I was born and raised in Florida, and then I lived in LA for 10 years. So just moving to the Catskills was not exactly a certain decision. It's it's beautiful in the summertime, sure, but what is January February and like even worse, like March and April when everybody else is like springtime. And I'm like, no, there is 2 feet of snow on the ground.
When Christi told me about her life in Los Angeles and New York City, it was missing a lot of details. She recalled the people, the relationships, her creative projects, but the cities themselves didn't seem to be offering her inspiration. After I asked her to describe her home in the Catskills with a DIY outdoor kitchen for boiling dried plants and herbs, and a studio with floor-to-ceiling shelves stacked with jars of harvested materials, Christi's voice lit up. This place, her physical space, is an intimate part of her craft. Now she can grow madder root herself, that tricky little plant that gave her an uninteresting beige color in Los Angeles, an unsuccessful experiment with natural dye that is now at the foundation of her work.
Having the space to be able to experience growing, something like madder root, which makes this beautiful, rich, deep red color, being able to see how it grows and, what its nature is in the world, and also be able to use it as a dye plant, which won't happen for a few more years because it needs to mature enough. But it apparently you need to let it grow for like 4 years before you can harvest it. And I'm like, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to harvest it by then. I'm going to be so attached to it. It's like, I can buy this stuff, dried and chopped up. Why would I dig this beautiful plant up? It's actually not that beautiful of a plant, but I just knowing what I know about it, I have an affinity towards it.
Christi's affinity for her homegrown madder root is testament to her strong connection to nature and to the earth. She now creates with the seasons. She's set up a holistic, ever-changing process that's as tied to her surroundings as it is to her love of making clothing. Her process is flexible enough to work with what nature offers, and her creative habits change with the weather. But no matter what, she always comes back to sewing clothing. She listens to what her creativity is telling her to do, and she responds to that creative pull.
So many times in my life in the past few years of working on my company, Mixed Color, I've said to myself, like, okay, I'm going to move on from making clothes now. Like, I'm going to just focus on the kind of education part of it, which I just really enjoy. And I love seeing people realizing like that they're way more creative than they thought they were, just through the process of learning how to make something. And I like watching you can almost watch their like synapses, connecting and firing new neurons. And so I just love that. But I just also really love clothes. And so I just keep, no matter how hard I try, I keep coming back to it. And every once in a while, I just need to make like a collection of clothes. And so I've basically just allowed myself to do that outside of any fashion context. And so, I was trying to do them seasonally. I was trying to do it maybe once a month, I'll have a new collection. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to make clothes when I want to make clothes and just allow that to be and not try and force it. And also it's kind of a seasonal thing for me. Like I don't want to be, dyeing with natural dyes in February. It's just, sometimes I do because like, oh, I just need to look at the marigolds or something. I need to look at this pile of dried marigolds. But most of the time, by the time winter comes, all I want to do is embroider. I just want to be like stitching by the fire, all cozied up under a blanket and like not moving. Yeah, it's like hibernation season. So I've allowed there to be room for that within Mixed Color. So sometimes it's vintage clothing that's been refurbished with embroidery. Sometimes it's handmade, naturally dyed clothes. But it's basically always handmade.
Rather than adhering to strict production schedules, Christi allows for freedom, grace, and innovation in her creative process. If she starts to feel like she has to force something to make it work, she lets it go.
And I think that we can tend to like torture ourselves and like, this is what I'm known for, so like I gotta keep doing it. As I said before, it's like sometimes when things are just really, really hard to do, that's usually a sign that like maybe it's not right.
You might be wondering, how can Christi manage to give up a successful career in the fashion industry to pursue her own business in upstate New York? Well, the thing about Christi is that she's intentional. Her designs require intention, and they're interactive, requiring that you, as a buyer or as a fellow maker, have intention as well. By pausing and listening to her intent, just lingering in that moment for a while, Christi manifests the things that she values. She pays attention to the signs given to her from her creative process, these omens we've followed so far. With all of this in mind, it kind of makes sense that she would get back the same energy and consideration that she gives to the earth. To illustrate this, I asked her to explain Stitch Wish, her embroidered talismans. Christi sells clothes, often vintage or handmade, adorned with talismans that she has embroidered. Or you can embroider them yourself with a stitch wish. Stitch wishes are little 3x3 squares with hand embroidery patterns. She creates the design, but it's meant to be a collaboration with you as another creator.
Each one has their own intention. And so if you're looking to like infuse your clothing with a little bit more meaning, or you want to even mending your clothing, you can use them as patches for mending, but then having something that really means it's a little bit more than just like a regular fabric patch. Like for example, one of them is like, it's a door with little star dots above it. And that one's called the portal. And it's all about kind of opening up to new ideas, opening up to new ways of thinking. Another one would be Guardian, which is the sword, and then rib cage is around that, and that one's supposed to be kind of a talisman for protection. And it's really about, like, for me, the time that you would spend stitching that embroidery onto another garment is the time that you would spend really infusing that garment with your intention. And so I've made the design, but it's also giving you the opportunity to it's like almost like a collaboration with the person that it ends up with, where they're able to then sew it into something. And I love seeing them sewn into things, because I'm like, oh wow, I never would have thought to put it there, or like, oh yeah, that like really works for that. So that's been really fun.
Something that I admire about Christi, which intensifies the more that I talk to her, is that she embraces duality in such a graceful way. Within one story, she can touch on a deep truth alongside a lighthearted, funny observation. When the weather gets cold, she turns inside to the warmth. She believes that you can reject fast fashion and still sew many clothes. Her work has serious spiritual meaning, but she laughs genuinely and often with silliness as she tells her stories. There's joy alongside a process for overcoming pain or trouble. There's humor in packing up your bags and moving across the country to take up natural dyeing. Her creations are as much about you as they are about her vision as a designer. She really wants you to love this craft as much as she does, and that's why she wants to collaborate with you on these embroideries.
Honestly, it's like, for me, it's supposed to be like a little bit of like a gateway into embroidery, because I hear so many people like, I can't sew. And I'm like, oh no, just sew this one little patch on. And then like, now you have a sewing needle, and now maybe you can sew something else with it. And I don't know, maybe, maybe just keep sewing. Maybe you like sewing a lot.
Christi's work is very transformative. It's experiential. At the heart of this is self-expression, which she believes is one of the most powerful ways that we can transform ourselves. Christi believes that clothes give us a voice to state our intentions to the world.
We're able to kind of communicate with one another through clothes. And I think that historically, like if you look back into pre-Western history, and the way that clothing was always imbued with these like very strong symbols. And so things were stitched to mean certain things. Like a lot of garments did have a lot of protective stitching on them, especially like at the openings and the wrists and the neck, because it was to keep evil spirits out. And so it was this sort of like putting this voice out into the world of like what your intention is. And I think in the modern day, we can still continue to do that. And you see that a lot in New York City, where people are wearing all black. And it's like this very much like, it's a defense mechanism, which you kind of need in a city when you're constantly encountering that many people. Having something that just like is, all black and really serious. And you've got your combat boots and, some like metal chains on, and it's like, don't mess with me. And then to the same degree, if you're like living out in the country and you're going out into nature and you're wearing the flower, you're wearing a floral dress because you're like, I want to blend in with this space, and I want to sort of call in that element of being like one with the flowers, basically. And so I think that's like, yeah, that's what, as far as clothing and self-expression, I feel like that's really kind of tied into how we experience ourselves in the world and how others see us, for better or for worse. But I do think it is something that we can do intentionally.
Christi views clothes as a conversation, one that we can have with each other with what we wear. As a designer, there is also a conversation between herself as the artist and the textiles, dyes, and techniques as her tools. This is in stark contrast to her career in the fashion industry.
And then after the fabric comes out of the dye, there's usually like a whole nother kind of creative conversation that goes on, because sometimes there's like weird splotches. And it's like, okay, well, I thought we were going to be done after the dyeing, but like, nope. Like, we have a whole new invitation to keep on working on this piece. Rarely ever does my initial idea of how a garment's going to look end up how the garment looks. I think that's also why I really had struggled with like the manufacturing aspect of having my own like quote fashion line, because people kept they wanted me to be able to produce the same thing over and over again, and like it doesn't really interest me, and I'm also not that good at that.
Christi showed me a bright neon yellow piece of cloth dyed with weld. It was a really stunning, shocking shade of yellow. And then she showed me the plant that it came from. It was shriveled and dried and completely void of color. The color of the dyed fabric was so vibrant, and the plant was so plain looking. Listening to Christi talk about this single source of natural dye speaks to her love of the entire craft, starting with the seed of a plant that will grow to color her finished dyed garment.
So this plant weld is something that they, when you look into the history of it, it's like the robes of the Vestal Virgins of the, were dyed with weld, and like all of these like old Greek stories that are told that involve weld, and everything is just, it's so deeply historical, which I just find so amazing. And yeah, I think too, the act of moving up to the Catskills and even moving to New York City, learning a whole new range of plants, where in Florida and LA, it's very tropical, very desert weather, both respectively. And so the plants there are of a very different kind that grow up here. So all of a sudden I became so much more interested in plants, because it was like, what's this? What's that? What's that? What's that? Like, I've never seen any of these before. And then on top of that, learning that a lot of them were medicinal, learning that a lot of them were dye plants and had so many different qualities to them that I hadn't known of before. And so it was just this like opening up a whole new world of growing plants and foraging plants.
In the Catskills, Christi found a deeper connection to the history of her art, a fresh perspective on teaching her craft to other people, and a flexible creative process that allows her to make things with wild abandon. And living there has also given her a wonderful philosophy about playtime.
I feel like it's very important to allow yourself time to just play with ideas. And I think it's important to not expect things to happen as you want them immediately. A lot of my time in my studio is spent just kind of like, I wonder what happens if I, maybe like sewed these stripes together and then cut them in a weird way and then reassembled them. Or I wonder what would happen if I, tried tying this garment like this before I dyed it, or all of these different kind of experiments that don't always turn out that great, to be honest. And that's why I love using a lot of scrap fabrics. That's why I kind of collect scrap fabrics and make sure not to throw out my own scraps so that I can play. And so I do think that playtime is way more valuable than we give it credit for. I think a lot of people, it's like, I don't have the time to waste just playing around with ideas. And it's like, no, you don't have the time to not do that. Like, it's like, no, you need to do that. Like, that's a very important part of the design process and also of the education process. I think that we don't give enough credit, just as a society in general, to like the amount that we learn from making mistakes and how important that lesson is. And I also don't ever throw out my mistakes. I usually just kind of fold them up. I've oftentimes will shove them angrily at the bottom of a drawer. Like I will express myself with how I feel about it, maybe like throw it across the room, but then it gets folded up and it gets put away, and I bring it out later usually. And it's like, okay, now when I'm like, no longer hating that piece of fabric, how can I make that work with something else? And I, so often it's just like turns into something else. And that is like one of the collection of clothings that I do. I mean, I guess more one of the ideas of clothing that I have is like the compost collection, where it is all these scraps of fabrics.
You might have guessed it, but playtime was an omen, the fourth omen in this part of her story. Playtime led to a project that defines Christi's approach to working with textiles and her philosophies about ecologically friendly practices. She called it her compost collection, and she decided to make an entire collection of clothing out of her scraps, over-dyeing them with a cohesive color to create a new color palette. She takes her mistakes, her little failures, and rebuilds them into something new and valuable. Christi walked me through a project from her compost collection to get a sense for her thoughts through each step.
So it's all these scraps of fabrics and they're mostly tests. And so it's like, oh, let me see what this dye looks like. Oh, I don't like the way that turned out, or like, let me try tying it this way. Oh, that didn't turn out right. Or let me, I tried painting this piece and I didn't like the way that. And so over time, I end up with all of these like smallish scraps. And then I sew these scraps together in kind of a random patchwork assortment. I say random, but it's kind of planned in the sense that like I use my aesthetic capabilities to be like, I like the way this looks. I don't like the way that looks. So yeah, I reassemble them using similar fabrics of similar weight sewn together. And then I make garments out of those and then re-dye them so that the colors all get cohesive. So when you over dye all of these different colors with one cohesive color, it makes it much more of like a smooth color palette. And so that's something I find like really like therapeutic in the way that I'm taking all of these accidents and waste and discards, and I am putting them back into something that is of value again. And it's the same with, my interest in getting things out of landfills and instead figuring out ways to reuse them. It's just like compost, where instead of throwing the banana peel in the trash, I'm going to throw it in the compost and it's going to turn into like rich soil for the garden, like to continue nurturing things. So it is like keeping things in the cycle, basically.
When I asked Christi if she wanted to talk about the future at all, she hesitated. Things are hard right now. It's hard to contemplate the future at the moment. But you know that Christi will be listening for her next omen, working with the signs that will determine her next project. And here's one thing that we can look forward to. She's about to release her first printed book.
So I am working with a publisher right now on a new book that has been, most of my like teaching energy has gone into writing that and also like getting really descriptive with how to do each of the stitches. And they have an amazing, I love my editor there. And she also has this like craft book editor who goes through each and every stitch and is like, what do you mean by this? Can you describe this better? And so it's like, I really like went into the mechanics of explaining things, but it's going to be a collection. It's basically like a build your own talisman book. And so it's a collection of different symbols that have been used throughout time, from botanicals to geometric symbols to different animals and how they've been used, and kind of gathers them all together in one place. And with a lot of different inspiration for kind of creating your own talisman and creating a ritual around your work, and also how to make your own designs if you want to. So that took up a lot of my teaching bandwidth this year, and it was really, really rewarding. And I feel like I learned a lot through the process of it. So that was really exciting.
Listening to Christi's winding journey from the fashion scenes in major cities to her quiet garden in the Catskills, her journey makes total sense to me. But I can understand that in those moments, when her first natural dye experiment failed, when she couldn't find her place in LA, when she didn't have enough space in New York City, those moments can be so frustrating. They can derail you creatively. But Christi decided to take those moments to listen, to follow her love of color, plants, embroidery, and she continued to immerse herself deeper and deeper into her craft. When something didn't work, she turned it into something else. She kept listening and having that conversation. And now she has a creative process that works for her. I left our conversation wondering, how can you encapsulate all of the layers of Christi's creative process? Well, you can do it with one word. And it's actually a word that you'll see closely associated with the meaning behind her clothing and her stitch wishes and her art. The word is magic.
For me, magic kind of comes from this idea that it stems from like an animism, a belief in animism. Like not everything, not just humans and animals have souls or have energies that they live in, And if you look at any pre-Western cultures, it's infused in every single element of their religion and every single element of their daily lives. Is like, yes, of course the rocks have energies. Of course the water, It's like, they seem kind of obvious, and like our kind of modern rationalization of everything, which has been really great for certain areas of life, has removed the spirituality element from a lot of things. And so for me, magic is infusing that back into things and recognizing that inanimate objects can still hold energy, and they can still, we can work with them to sort of talk with other elements of the world, talk with other unseen forces. And I think that's what it comes down to, is like, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does seem like there is kind of like an integral pattern flowing through all things, which, you can call that whatever you want. You can call that energy, you can call it, divinity. Some people call it whatever, other more like religious based things. But I think it's about recognizing that and recognizing that we have the power to sort of use that for betterment, for the betterment of our own lives. We have the power to use that for good. It doesn't really matter if you like buy into it or not. It's like, it's just a more fun way to live, like with the idea that like things are alive, there is a life in things, even if they aren't necessarily alive. And I feel that too, like when I, if I have a used article of clothing, because I do a lot of embroidery on vintage pieces. And so like, I will get these pieces of clothing and it's like, this piece of clothing had a life before, it was in my hands. And when I put it on, I can kind of almost feel like, oh, okay, there is a conversation happening where like this article of clothing knows what needs to happen more than I do. And I will allow myself to like get quiet enough to listen to that.
That was Meg Stively speaking with textile artist Christi Johnson. You can find Christi at www.mixedcolor.net. Be sure to read Remnant Revivals, her 3-part series published in Seamwork magazine in issues 73 to 75. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com too. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes every month for our members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon.